As our Arcade Treasures series hits 1983, things still seem to be going fine, while there's still some pretty big releases kicking around, with the likes of Dragon's Lair, Star Wars and Spy Hunter all doing very well indeed. However, there is most certainly a gathering storm on the horizon, with business in the American arcades gradually dropping as we go through the year. The big games, when they do hit, act as something of a band-aid against the crash that was coming, but they weren't going to be able to stop it. I mentioned in the previous vid that one old amusement company, Rockola of Nibbler fame, ended their rather short-lived flirtation with arcade games in this year because they looked at the long-term forecast and clearly didn't like what they saw, and they were pretty smart to do that. Others, well, they weren't so lucky. Still, I've got some more neat games to look at in this little video. We've got the sequels to the almighty Mr. Do that did so well last year, a groundbreaking stunner of a gun game from Exidy, a landmark appearance for 3D polygons on the arcade floor, a couple more European hits and, of course, a couple of titles that are just plain weird as all hell. And so, let's get on with it by going back to the world of Universal's favourite Powerball chucking clown. Covering Mr. Do's 3 sequels takes us a little bit into 1984, but I felt it would be rather silly to not cover them together, as they are something of a wild bunch. The original was, of course, one of 1982's biggest hits, one of the best single-screen games ever, one that popularised the idea of conversion kits, and just generally a hugely important title. While it's not surprising that the sequels to Mr. Do weren't able to come close to that original game's impact and popularity, that doesn't mean that they're all unworthy. All 3 of them are very different from each other, taking Mr. Do in various directions, with the results being somewhat mixed. First, from September 1983, we have Mr. Do's Castle, which is also known as Mr. Do vs Unicorns in Asia. This is a wildly different game from the original, a platformer where you climb ladders, collect cherries, and take out the aforementioned unicorns. This time you use a mallet instead of a powerball, and the idea is that you knock out the blocks as you walk on them. There's several different ones, including key blocks that help to bring out the alpha monster, or skull blocks that can take out quite a lot of the enemies. There's a fair bit of the old Space Panic formula going on here, seeing as knocking out blocks obviously creates holes that enemies can fall through, and you can then knock them through the hole to stun them further. Although generally speaking, you need to drop blocks on the unicorns in order to kill them. This game's quite tough, although it helps that there's a couple of different ways to go about actually playing the levels. Much like the original, there's a few things going on. On the whole, it's decent, but it doesn't really get anywhere near the level of the original. I guess that when it comes to this sort of platformer, I'd rather go and play Lode Runner or something similar, as opposed to Mr. Do's Castle. We move into 1984 now, and January of 1984 sees the release of Mr. Do's Wild Ride. Again, the formula has changed a fair bit. Now, our heroic clown is on a roller coaster. He's got to use ladders to avoid the carts and various other enemies as they speed their way along the track. He can run at the expense of his bonus, and he gets a big bonus at the end of each level. What that is depends on how many cherries he's picked up. I have to be honest and say that I think this game is rubbish. One of the things I really enjoy about the Mr. Do games is how deep they are, particularly when it comes to arcade titles of this vintage, and this, well, it doesn't have any of that. It's a very plain and simple Donkey Kong-esque game that also ends up feeling really slow, with lots of waiting around just to make sure you don't get flattened by a cart. A platform game where you're pretty much on a rail and there's literally only one way to get to the finish in each level? It's just really boring, to be honest, and 3 years after Kong it's not going to stand out at all. Amusingly, this game did actually sort of act as a sequel to Donkey Kong, on the ZX Spectrum. Ocean's unofficial Donkey Kong game, simply called Kong, was one of their biggest early hits, and they followed it up with a game called Kong Strikes Back. However, rather than being based on any of the other DK games, it was based on Mr. Do's Wild Ride. A curious fact, that one, and honestly more interesting than the arcade game in question. Happily, the last Mr. Do game for a while is a whopper of a return to form. Do 1-1 came out in November 1984, and it's also known as Super Piero in Japan, although that title only came about after it was re-released in 1987. The platform experiments are over. We're back to a single screen maze type affair, and once again we've got a whole load of different things to play with. The objective generally is to take out all the enemies as opposed to picking up all the dots, although you can finish a level by doing either of these things. The Powerball is back, and there's also traps you can trigger, such as big old logs that'll run over any enemy in their path. Or indeed you, so you best watch out when you use them. The mechanic I love here is the line that follows the clown. You use this to make big squares or rectangles. Doing this turns the regular dots into cherries, as well as other bits of fruit if you do it again, and this ups your score. You also use this to reveal other secrets and to trigger the alpha monster. Once again, we've got the depth that I want in a Mr. Do game. The stages are very well constructed with a whole lot of added depth to them thanks to the slopes. There's ridiculously earwormy music. To me, while Castle and Wild Ride do kind of feel like spin-offs, Do 1-1 is the true sequel to the original, the game that really expands on Kazutoshi Ueda's classic in all the best ways and ends up being almost as good. It is also the last time the clown would be seen in the arcade for a while. He eventually resurfaced in 1996 when Visco released Neo Mr. Do, but I guess that's something to be covered at another time. Exidy has cropped up a couple of times in this series, first with Targ and Spectre in 1980, then with Mousetrap and Venture in 1981, and while we didn't see them in 1982, they're back with a literal bang in 1983 with an absolute winner of a game that would be a revolution in a genre that we've not looked at in the Arcade Treasures series yet, that being the gun game. Here's Crossbow, the first of several famous Exidy gun games, and arguably still the best of them, although we'll undoubtedly be looking at a couple more of these as we go on. The game, designed by Nick Ilian and Larry Hutchison, was billed as an adventure shooting title that took its inspiration from old electromechanical rifle games, a title with a medieval setting where you help a group of adventurers on their quest, shooting obstacles in their way, or indeed anything that gets chucked at or dropped on them. It could be an arrow, a rock, a fireball, a bolt of lightning. Generally speaking, if it's on screen then you can shoot it. Crossbow uses custom arcade hardware, that being How Alive's 440 system, and these Exidy gun games are also known as alliterative shooting, mainly because the 5 other gun games that were released as conversion kits for Crossbow also began with the letter C. The escort mechanic that's featured in Crossbow does make the game feel a hell of a lot different from the more plain shooting gallery style gun games that existed before it. It's not a totally maniacal game where you're simply doing nothing but blasting, with the odd little bit of space for you to get your bearings before another wave of projectiles comes along. Of course, it pays to be a bit more measured with your shots. You really don't want to accidentally strike any of your friends, as not only does this tend to make you panic, it slows them up and eventually kills them if you do it too much. The adventure aspect of the game, simple though it may be, also adds a lot. You gain new friends along the way, and it's fun to explore the various areas of the game, finding an ideal path and going through them all on your way to hopefully take out the Master of Darkness, whose eyes constantly make brief appearances in each area. It's fun to get progressively better at each stage as you go along, finding whatever secrets lay within and maximising your score, but another thing that really hits just right is the sound. Crossbow is likely the first game to consist entirely of digitised music and effects, and they add a whole lot of character to the adventure. According to the Golden Age arcade historian, the sound of Crossbow was the job of a man named Ken Nicholson, and the large amount of digitised effects was a consequence of one of the 440 system's limitations. There wasn't enough room to store longer pieces of music or anything like that, and so everything had to be made up of short samples. In the end, it works out pretty damn well, and the cabinet itself, complete with an appropriately large and very convincing crossbow joystick, also warrants a mention. Crossbow wasn't necessarily a huge hit, and perhaps isn't even the most famous of the XD gun games nowadays. That honour more than likely goes to Chiller, thanks to the controversy associated with that game. However, it was successful enough to keep the series of gun games going, and it deserves a lot of respect for adding a whole bunch of depth to the genre that simply wasn't there before its arrival. And so, we move on to the subject of laserdiscs. As I alluded to in the previous vid when talking about Cinematronic's various woes, they'd be helped out rather significantly by the arrival of Dragon's Lair in June of 1983, one of the most famous games of the decade, and something of a fillip for the arcade business as a whole, creating a large, if eventually short-lived, rush of punters back to the floor at a point when businesses and operators were starting to feel the pinch. Dirk Ladarin's Adventure wasn't quite the first Laserdisc game, mind you. Sega's Astron Belt came out in Japan a month previously, and it's a wholly different beast to Rick Dyer's QuickTime event-based adventure, instead being a shoot-'em-up that combines 2D graphics with full-motion video. The Laserdisc game that we're going to cover here is much closer to the Astron Belt formula than it is to Dragon's Lair, and it's also incredibly important in another way. It's the first arcade game, and in fact the first game full stop, to use real-time 3D computer graphics. It is, of course, Cimatrek's Cube Quest, released in December of 1983. The company behind this game, Cimatrek, is a short-lived one. Noah Anglin, previously an executive at Atari and Exidy, was its founder, and the company took form out of himself and a few other employees such as Paul Newell and Duncan Moorhead, both of whom Anglin poached from GCE for his new setup. Anglin and these guys worked on the development of the Vectrex at GCE, and Cimatrek likely formed after the console was finished. If Cube Quest had been more successful, and if the bottom hadn't fallen out of everything in North America, a home version of the game would have ended up arriving on the Vectrex. This didn't happen, although a prototype of the Vectrex version, whose development actually predates the arcade, is out there, albeit not readily available to play. As it is, Cube Quest would end up being Cimatrek's only released title. By the time it came out, the Laserdisc boom was already reaching its end, the crash was in full swing, and Cimatrek gave up the ghost. More on that in a bit, but as far as the game itself goes, the idea is that you travel between different nodes in this cube, and yes, it's a cube because such things were popular thanks to old Mr. Erno Rubik, aiming to reach the treasure of Miffa at the end. When you travel, you generally go through two different waves, one where you shoot down enemies, and another where you manoeuvre through various barriers. Generally speaking, the second one is a bit more fun than the first. There are also Dwellers of the Dark dotted around the game's world that you can destroy for big bonuses, and yeah, that's kind of it. Claim the treasure, then do it all over again. That's kind of it. Aside from one of the stranger Easter eggs in arcade history, there's a short clip of a nude woman hidden in the game's monitor test mode. No knockers are on show, but she is flinging her hair around like she's auditioning for a Timotei advert. You can't access this in regular gameplay, by the way. Cube Quest, much like a lot of other Laserdisc titles, suffers due to being rather shallow. Initially it's pretty damn cool to look at, but that kinda wears off once you've seen the cool backgrounds a few times. It is most certainly a beast. The video was made by computer graphic company Robert Abel and Associates, who also had a hand in Cimatrek itself, and the hardware is powerful enough to run both those images and the polygons pretty smoothly. But the gameplay just isn't really there in the end. Even when it comes to Laserdisc games, it ends up far behind the likes of Gottlieb's Mach 3, which came out a couple of months previously. Still, it wasn't for lack of effort. According to an interview with Paul Newell for Atari Compendium, he and the rest of Cimatrek pretty much gave the game everything they could over the year or so that it was in development, at a company that pretty much started with nothing, literally people sitting on the floor of an empty office. All things considered, they hardly did a bad job. However, Newell considered the final product to ultimately be incomplete. It needed a couple of months more at least to get to a finished state, but Symmetrek didn't have enough time for that, and in the end whatever was done had to be put out there just so, well, there'd at least be something to show for all the effort and hours put in. In the end, Symmetrek simply ran out of money, and the eventual release of Cube Quest was largely handled by a skeleton staff that knocked together machines out of whatever parts had been completed. By the time Cube Quest got out there, the company was already finished. Even with that in mind, the game did still end up coming out in a rather snazzy, albeit extremely rare cabinet. Even if Cube Quest itself isn't a particularly good game, it is still an important landmark moment for the industry, and for that alone, it warrants some respect. We're off to the racing tracks for the next game, another one that's a pretty powerful bit of kit for 1983. TX1 is the first game released by Tatsumi, or Tasmi. Tatsumi didn't release too many arcade games, but they generally put out titles that were pretty high spec by the day's standards, and this one was a decent hit for both Namco in Japan and Atari everywhere else. Indeed, TX1 would be a continued presence in Japanese arcades for a good few years after its release, and it is also another first. I am pretty sure that TX1 is the first video arcade game to use multiple screens, coming with a free screen display. The game is quite similar to Namco's almighty Pole Position from the previous year, albeit much more powerful. Still, the similarities are such that when Atari got their hands on the game, it was marketed somewhat as a successor to Namco's title, although TX1 is a totally different game. The goal is simple enough, of course. You control an F1 car, and you have to get to the end of each course. Like Pole Position, the game's trying to be more of a simulation of driving as opposed to something more arcadey, but the courses here aren't circuits. Instead, you've got to get from A to B, and the game's 5 courses actually consist of multiple branching paths. Again, TX1 was the first game to do this, and it was a significant influence on Sega's Outrun. As you might expect considering the game's free screen display, the cabinet for the game is a monster, although the triple screen is kind of an extravagance. All of the main action occurs on the middle screen, so you don't really need the other two. Still looks lovely, mind you, and TX1 has a lot of other features that weren't present in Pole Position. You've got properly implemented slopes and hills, force feedback on the wheel, tunnels. There's a lot going on for the time. TX1 and its sequel, 1984's TX1 V8, may well have been luxury items, but that didn't stop the game being very big in Japan. It essentially took over Pole Position's spot at the front of the arcade pack. Despite this, and despite being a cracking racer, the game isn't talked about an awful lot these days. However, this isn't the last time we'll be seeing Tatsumi in action. We saw Sun Electronics, or Sunsoft, in the last video with Kangaroo, a Donkey Kong-esque platformer that was kind of flawed but definitely had its charms. And now, in 1983, they're back again with Arabian. It's another Donkey Kong-esque platformer, but it's a vast improvement over their previous title. Our prince jump kicks his way through various foes over the course of 4 different stages, or pages as they're presented here, and there's a decent amount of variation. You're taking on evil genies, navigating caves, climbing on ropes and vines, jumping on flying carpets. It is a pretty good quality platformer. The aim of each stage is to collect the jars that spell out the word Arabian, and ideally you do this in sequence so that you get a bonus. Typically that's a lot harder than it sounds, seeing as there's so much stuff coming at you. This was a decent hit for Sun again, both in Japan and the US, although not actually as big a hit as Kangaroo was when it comes to the States. An age-old Atari memo from July 1983 has Kangaroo's domestic sales at nearly 10,000, whereas Arabian's was, at the time of the memo, only at nearly 2,000, although it probably sold a little bit more than that. It is curious to look at an old memo like this and see that, for Atari, this 2000 figure was, at the time, identical to that of Nintendo's Mario Brothers, which was thoroughly outstripped at the time by the 4,000 units sold for Bagman. Pah! In your face, Ninty! That's a win for Europe if ever I saw one. Who cares anything about what happened later? Speaking of Europe, it's time to head over there and check out a couple of arcades. Indeed, it's time to catch up with the almighty Stamper Brothers, who, in the past video, were seen in action for Xylec, where they had a hand in distributing The Pit with their American mate Joel Hochberg, and they also made Blueprint, a really good game that was picked up by Jaleco. Indeed, the relationship between Xylec and Jaleco continues in 1983 with Saturn, a perfectly okay space shooter title that I think is the reason why some people erroneously credit the Stampers with making Konami's G-Rus. They made a thematically similar title that's also based around planets and, well, wires get crossed. Saturn is decent, but it's not really the game I want to talk about here. Instead, I want to look at Dingo. Dingo is an oddity. It's not a Xylec game, and was in fact released by the Stampers through Ashby Computers and Graphics. In other words, Ultimate Play the Game. While Ultimate became the kins of the Spectrum, Dingo was the only game ACG released to the arcades, and it's a curious one mainly because, well, it's awful. This is about as standard a maze game as it gets. You collect fruit, you occasionally throw a bit of fruit at an enemy if they're getting close to you watch out for them chucking fruit at you, and that's it pretty much. The most curious thing is the weird "Dingo will remember you" message in the high score screen, which sounds more like a threat than anything else. A couple of years ago this may have been okay, but it's just not cutting it at all in 1983. The game was kind of forgotten almost as soon as it came out, really. In the end, Dingo was ACG's only arcade game because the Stampers, quite rightly at the time, decided to put all their efforts into making computer games, specifically for the Speccy. Although their brief arcade flirtation here does make me wonder. Ultimate initially became big because they made titles with fast, arcade-quality gameplay for the Spectrum. The Stampers' arcade experience served them very well, and the likes of Jetpack, Cookie, Pst and Sabrewolf could have easily been arcade games if you boofed the graphics and sound up a little. They'd have been bloody good ones too, certainly better than Dingo. It is a shame that, alas, arcade versions of these games weren't ever made. I think Jetpack especially could have been a big hit on the floor, as it's an all-timer of a shooter on the Spectrum. Similarly, once Ultimate hit big, there wasn't any thought whatsoever of bringing old Dingo from the arcade to the home, although a homebrew version of the title was made in 2011, complete with lovely artwork by the superb Mark R. Jones, previously of Ocean. Staying in Europe, I have two games here by a rather obscure company called Jetsoft. Precious little indeed is known about this company, although from what I can gather they were based somewhere in northern England. This is probably their most famous game, Cavelon, a maze game where you play as a knight and you pick up pieces of a door inside this rather simple looking maze, fighting other knights as you go with your bow and arrow and being careful to avoid their shots. The dungeon may be pretty basic, but this isn't a wholly bad game. You get the odd screen clearing effect here and there, and it is kind of one of those titles that ends up pulling you back, even if it is kinda simple and a little bit janky. Cavelon is probably more famous as a computer game than as an arcade. It got a couple of conversions in '84 thanks to Ocean Software, and the reviews for the game there were generally very decent. One strange thing is that Jetsoft also apparently released, or were at least connected to an arcade game called Excalibur that isn't in MAME. Again, details are very hazy, although one old review in Home Computing Weekly said that Cavelon was a home port of Excalibur. Now this may just be totally incorrect, although it is also possible that Cavelon was known as Excalibur in some other territories. Rather mysterious. Not an amazing game, but not an awful one. If you thought that Cavelon looked janky, then you haven't seen Bongo, Jetsoft's other game from 1983, and the only other one by them that you can play in MAME. This is a platformer. It's not the usual Donkey Kong type one where you get to the top, instead being a bit more like Pitfall or Hunchback, a flick screen game where you go from left to right, traversing traps, jumping over pits and projectiles, that sort of thing. There are collectibles kicking around, but you don't really need to bother picking them up if you don't feel like it, and the music's all stuff like La Cucaracha and what have you. It's got a bit of an Indiana Jones aesthetic going on, and oh boy is it ropey. The collision detection is way off, the jumping is weird, the movement is all over, the dinosaur that's chasing you is ridiculous. Yeah, I'd be hard pressed to say that this is a good game. And yet, I don't know, there's always something kind of fun about seeing an arcade game that's this much of a mess. Clearly it's a title that has been rather knocked together by folks who probably had absolutely bugger all in the way of resources to play with, but there's a certain pull when it comes to dealing with the game's rather significant crap factor. You can obviously see why this game didn't get anywhere at all, but it is weirdly cool to look back on. Again, this did get a home version, although only to the C64 this time, where it was called Quarry. To be honest, playing it on Commodore is about the same as playing the arcade version. We've almost reached the finishing line here, and here's another title that is pretty average but is at least trying to do something different. This is Hoccer, a game by Eastern Microelectronics, or EME. Now don't beat yourself up if you don't know anything about these fellas. Very little is known about them aside from that they hailed from New Jersey, and Hoccer is the only game of theirs that we can play in MAME. Hardware-wise, it's a pretty standard Z80 based title, running on the same gear that powered the classic likes of Marine Boy by Hoccer, and the game itself is an actually quite fun cross between ice hockey and soccer, just as the title suggests. You go through the stages by using your stick to send the opponents into the walls, and there's a puck kicking around. You can use this to take out opponents at a longer range, but you can also shoot this puck into the moving goal for a bonus. The opponents can use the puck too, so watch out. It's not really a sports game as such. There's no way for the opponent to score, and the aim is to take out the opponents rather than scoring yourself. It's not a bad concept on the whole. I kind of enjoy games where the goal is to ban into opponents and take them over the edge, and it's fun to see Hoccer as an earlier take on something like Namco's Motos. I wonder what this would have been like if it was actually a sports game, mind you. One with full teams, all bashing into each other, having to actually put the puck into the net. That might have been really frickin' good. As it is, Hoccer is as obscure as it gets, although it is actually something I had quite a lot of fun playing. Go check it out if you're curious. And finally, well, there is absolutely no way I could let 1983 pass without covering one of the strangest games you're going to find in MAME, a game that has forever had arcade heads wondering just where on earth it came from. We've seen some oddities in these videos so far, but nothing even remotely comes close to Uncle Poo. You'd swear that this title is fake, something knocked up much later for a laugh and then presented like it was from the Golden Age. But no, it is actually a game from 1983. Even the name of the company behind it is a peach. It was released by, Diatech. Diet Tech? I mean, come the hell on. Uncle Poo is the only game these folks released, and we don't have a clue where they came from. I fancy that it's a Japanese outfit, mind you. You play as this old man who can fart on command, and he uses these farts not just to ward away beasts, but to take out blocks that are in his way. The main goal is to collect gems, and you can also collect money bags. When you collect the cash, all the blocks on screen disappear, which is handy and occasionally necessary. Guff your way through the obstacles, pick up the gems, don't get caught in the big wave that's chasing you, and move on to the next stage. That's about it. The almighty Mamehaze, in the comments for the previous vid, posited that the guys who made the infamous Jack the Giant Killer may well have made Uncle Pooh as well. They both use the same hardware, and there's also similarities in the art style. Indeed, Hayes wonders if they also made some other infamous games from this time, including the absolutely horrific Loverboy, a game that is also from 1983, but we absolutely cannot cover here because it involves a naked man chasing women about and is quite literally wrong in every single way possible. Loverboy is by far the worst arcade game ever, and whoever created it should literally be shot into the sun, regardless of anything else they did. But as far as Uncle Pooh goes, the game's actually not terrible, unlike the other titles these folks may have made. It moves alright, it's got charm, it's kind of fun to play. Yeah, a whole load better than Jack the Giant Killer. Not a hidden classic by any stretch, but certainly not a regrettable experience. God only knows what these guys were on, however. I mean, it's kind of cheap and easy to say that, oh gee, the guys who made these games must have been high. But well, look at them. And there we go. Another year in the books. It has certainly been a wild ride. Only a lot more exciting than the one that Mr. Do was on. There'll be more fun things to look at in 1984, of course. The North American crash may well have been in full flow, but that doesn't mean nothing of note came out that year. But hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now.